Hello and welcome back to the studio. Today, something different again from the last painting, which was the Arizona scene, which is all sepias and browns. This time I've gone completely green and more familiar territory because I used a reference photograph to give me some sort of measurement of what I was doing. Now, the real inspiration behind this was a Bob Ross classic painting called Emerald Waters. I painted it many years ago and I've always enjoyed looking at it and painting green tones. So I thought, let's paint something that I'm going to be calling a moment of reflection. I think in the busy, hectic world that we live in, sometimes we feel sort of almost obliged to try and throw the kitchen sink at our paintings, include everything, mountains, trees, bushes, and maybe even a grizzly bear sitting in the corner eating a picnic. Sometimes we just overload ourselves with information, and I wanted to paint something which is just far more simple. Just to play with some green tones, to see what I could do just in a nice simple way without getting too sort of tied up in all the little details of things. So I encourage you to take a moment of reflection. Life mustn't be too hectic so we don't enjoy our painting. Now, before I move on to painting, a big thank you to all you lovely subscribers and watchers who have made my little channel grow a little bigger. Some of my recent videos have seen some of the best viewing figures I've ever had. So, let's carry on painting and enjoying things together. Happy painting, people. This is a classic Bob Ross painting, Emerald Waters, and I saw this photograph and thought, wow, maybe I could reproduce something like that. I see if I can make a good reflection and maybe some nice misty effects. I've got a nice black canvas already set up. First thing to do is set the horizon line out. I measured up about 5 inches and put some tape in place. I'm going to use some acrylic for a background. This is a mixed media painting. So I have blue, green and a little bit of grey gesso that, well, seems determined to get off my plate. That's tricked it. I'll turn it the other way up. I'm looking for a sort of silvery green colour, blue hue maybe. And the technique I'm using is, well, sort of like imagine using a feather duster. I'm flicking using the corner of an old fan brush. I don't use my oil painting fan brushes for acrylics. I keep them separate. As you see, what I'm really looking for here is the impression of some distant trees, maybe on a very steep hillside. The only problem is once you've completed this stage and you stand back, you see, well, I see a hedge. Not quite a hillside, but we'll let that dry for a bit. Maybe 20 minutes. Now, let's try and get some more tree details in. I've got an old fan brush which I doctored to be sort of like a dagger brush and a real cheap little brush that I can use. I want to try and create the illusion of some distant trees, so let's make some sort of fir tree shapes. It doesn't have to be perfect at this stage, it just has to be an impression. It turns out this cheap little brush was the best thing to use. I just sort of paint the tips of some fir trees. I dot them about in the shadows and then leave it to dry completely. Now for some oil painting. Today I'm going to be using some Bob Ross liquid clear oil paint. I keep it in a small airtight container for ease of use, and of course I'm using an old Bob Ross brush with a little orange tip on its handle. As always, I want to apply a very thin coating, but this time just down to this horizon line. I'll work on the foreground later. Now, firm grip on the canvas and really scrub this in. A thin coat is all you need. I'll leave a link to a how-to video up here in the corner. Once you've completed scrubbing on that thin coat, just finish off with some long flat strokes, just to even out the surface. I'm using this brush again in a moment, but make sure you give it a dry clean first. I think one or two of you forget to do that. Here's my very basic looking palette. Titanium white, a little Prussian blue and a little speck of black. I'm creating a misty effect, so very little paint at this stage. Let's start with plain white. And as you see, I just swirl it onto the canvas. You can scrub it on so thinly you can still see the trees through the background. Let's add a little touch of blue, see what that looks like. Surprisingly, that little bit of blue makes the colour a little more dense. So you have a choice of either thick and dense, foggy looking misty areas or slightly thinner see-through areas. This is a lot of fun to play with, and you'll see me go backwards and forwards over my painting several times. I want to bring in some heavier looking mist at the top, maybe some low cloud, just to sort of squash the top of my painting down. And there you go. After a little bit of play, I've created my background. It's time to take off the tape. Now let's add some more of that liquid clear to this lower section. Again, scrub it on thin. Now you know from previous videos that I like to plan. So I'm going to put a few little marks on here. I think there should be a little island in this gap. And I think maybe a little bit of room on this right hand side for some distant trees, maybe a very steep hillside. I'll scratch that on with the point of my palette knife. And of course a little bit of detail here on the left as well. Now let's think about putting in some nice reflections of that misty background. Press and pull straight down. Firm pressure here. Again, I've added a touch of blue to my colour. Look at your reference photographs carefully to make sure you actually get these reflections of the background nice and accurate. Now, let's make a lovely forest green tone. I'm going to take some black, a good chunk of sap green. Mix them together well. You can add in some phthalo blue and one other, alizarin crimson. Just good dark colours, but blend them together very well. There. Now, time for a fresh but old brush again. I pick up a little of the green paint. I want this to be nice and dark, so I don't want to use my other old brush. Tap your paint well into the bristles and just block in this area. Notice I'm using a dabbing stroke. I want to create some texture. I want to be able to put highlights on this, and to make them stick easier, I texture the surface with some dabbing strokes. When I get down to the water's edge, I can just pull down some colour for the reflections. We'll see later on that I actually get into a bit of a pickle with this, but well, that's all to be discovered later in the video, so make sure you carry on watching all the way to the end. I use the same technique on this left hand side of my painting. Again, just dabbing in some nice dark green and pulling it down into the water for the reflections. Use your fingers to check the coverage. That looks a bit oily. So touch here, look a bit stronger, that's a bit better. I'll do this section as well, although I haven't actually figured out where the island's going to go. I'll just drop in the green for the time being. Today I'm going to be using a filbert brush for my highlighting. It's a bit smaller and more delicate and more suitable to this sort of smaller area of my painting. But notice how I load it by pushing up into the paint, just like I would do with a 1-inch brush or even an oval brush. I start off with just a few dabs of colour to check and see if it's bright enough. No, not quite. Let's add a tiny bit more cad yellow. Bear in mind, the focal point is going to be the island, so I don't want to overdo this. I just let these little colours drift along and pick out individual little groups of trees. I over highlighted this section of my painting. There wasn't too much paint there, so I just used my old brush just to dab in a little bit of shadow. Now, let's add a few reflections of those little bright highlights. They don't have to be too perfect, just get them roughly in line. Now for some magic, I'm going to use a Bob Ross blender brush, lovely and soft. I would just want to diffuse my reflections a little bit, but what's happened? That's right, I pressed just slightly too hard and I managed to take everything off. No harm done though. Let's put on some highlights and repeat that process, but this time finger and thumb only. You'll find these soft blender brushes tend to really grip the canvas. They're almost too soft. There. A better magic trick the second time around. let's add a waterline and maybe a shimmering light effect on the distant water. As you can see, my colour is very, very much not pure white. It's got lavender mixed in with it and blue and all sorts. Perfect. Now then, with your palette knife, stay nice and level on that horizon line. Just tap in a little bead of paint. Firm pressure here and slide it along. I'll even add the suggestion of a little waterline under my little distant land mass on the right. Again, nothing too bold at this stage. You'll see in a moment I'm going to be using this white paint to create more of a depth to it, more shimmer. So, grab my 1-inch brush and just press and pull down that colour, just to make it a little stronger. Same again this side. Again, use a reference photograph if you have to, and just pull down. There. So everything's going quite smoothly with my painting, but this next area is something which I'm going to sort of spend a moment just mapping out. I think this is an area of painting which some people get into a bit of a pickle with sometimes. They have a big dark mass and sort of don't know where they're going with it. So I take a few moments just to map things out using the head of a brush handle. Nothing too technical there. Now, don't forget, watch my video all the way through because you'll see that there are lots more tips and tricks to come. I also get myself into a bit of a pickle with these reflections, so see how I cope with it and a rapidly drying canvas. Let's enjoy the rest of the painting. As I just mentioned, figuring out where things are in this big mass of dark can sometimes be a challenge. So I'm just scratching on a few details. Maybe a tree here, another tree in the distance just here, and maybe something here. But I leave a little shadow as well. We'll see what that looks like later on in the painting. I also want to think about a nice fir tree here, just over the edge of that dark, and let's give them a couple of friends. One here and one here. That's it. Nothing more special than that. Just as before, I go back into my various mixtures of yellows and sap greens and just add a few little touches of highlight. I work on one tree at a time, saving the shadows as I go. If you enjoy my videos and you want to support the channel, don't forget, leave a like. You can even subscribe to the channel. It's all free, but it really helps my channel grow. But if you want to go one step further, you could leave a little donation in my coffee cup. There's a link down below. I spend all the money on painting supplies for the next video. Thank you. I'm adding just a few suggestions of those fir trees. I just need the tips at this stage. Now, let's go in with a little highlight. Again, the light is coming strongly from the left, so that's the side that gets most of these highlights. Just a little bit on the edge of the fan brush. Again, sap green, cad yellow, and maybe a little bit of Indian yellow, but nothing else. As my brush runs out of colour, I do the more shadowy areas. Save those darks. They really are your best friend in a painting. If you struggle with a fan brush, you can also use the little filbert brush. It actually does a really good job of highlighting fir trees. Just a few touches and there you go. Very three-dimensional. I'll do this little tree as well. And before you know it, you've got a whole island full of trees. I'll drop in some reflections. There. Once again, this lovely soft brush, but this time I'm going to use it more on a corner. I want to do just individual little sections of these reflections. More controllable, but as you see, I managed to wipe them all off again. What happened? Well, what happened is that my painting started to dry. I did this over a couple of days, and of course the dark underpainting colour, the green, dried out, and my highlights didn't stick very well. So even being delicate, I still managed to wipe them off. Bear that in mind when you're doing your own paintings. Now, a little problem here. My reflection shadow in the water was a little wider than the effect above. So notice how I did a little sneaky trick here. I added a little extra detail to the island above and then dropped it in the reflection below. Now let's do the main feature, the island. I want this to appear closer to me in the painting, so I make sure it is below that horizon line. Don't cover up all the lovely reflections of the background that we included earlier on in the painting. Now, I'm also going to be using a new filbert brush to stab in those lovely dark colours. I want more control this time, slightly more detail. You'll find the filbert brush is a very useful brush and one that you should be using very often. I'll even make a little fir tree at the background. Now, top tip, stand back and have a good look. I think this looks a little bit too small. I want to make it bigger and maybe a little wider, especially on the left side. And that lump on the right, it doesn't really fit the island above. Let's make a few changes. It's easy to do at this stage, much harder later on. Here's a little trick you can try on your next painting. I wanted this tree to be a little more sort of transparent, have a few little holes through it so I could see the background. I've taken a little cotton bud and just stab a few little holes through the tree. Watch what happens next. I've got a Bob Ross liner brush and a little drop of thinners and thinned out my black to make some silhouettes of tree trunks. You can see the tree trunks as they pass through those little transparent areas in my tree. It looks even more three-dimensional than normal. I'll add a few more little tree trunks here and there. I want lots of detail in this painting, and I spend a good amount of time playing with my paint. And that's really the whole idea of painting, is to be relaxed and enjoy yourself. Shouldn't be too stressful. Just as before, I add some highlights, but this time, because this is my feature in the painting, I make them a little brighter. A little more cad yellow, a little more sap green, to make it sort of an acid green colour, something that really pops off the canvas. I even add a speck of white, but take care, you'll see in a moment, I can get you into trouble. And add a little bit of vegetation at the base of these trees, maybe some grass. But you see, well, I couldn't stop interfering in that little area. I kept adding more and more paint to it until eventually, well, I smudged it. Top tip, before you want to repair something, scrape off the colour that's there first. Then you can reapply that lovely dark underpainting colour. It'll stick so much easier. There you are, a few dabs, and my little oops has gone. Now I can reapply my highlights without getting into a pickle, hopefully. I want to make a part of my painting really stand out. So as I start adding these reflections in, I think I really want to make something really stand out brightly. I think I'm going to be picking an area about here. I've added a tiny speck of white, and I mean tiny. Look at that. Wow. It really jumps off the canvas. But you can't have too many superstars in a painting. They will end up fighting with each other. So one or two really bright areas are all you need. I'll add a few little dots down in the water for reflections as well. Now, remember what I was saying about getting into trouble with reflections? Well, I'm in trouble again. This part of my canvas is really dried now, and even though I try very hard to make these blur, well, they don't really want to move. Again, the underpainting, the dark green colour I put on there has dried, and these reflections have really bonded to the surface. They won't blend very much at all. I even tried pushing really hard with this brush, but no, they're just not having it. As a last resort, I even go back to my old dark green brush just to put a bit of extra shadow in on the right hand side of my island. You do have to work with what your canvas is doing sometimes, and so in this instance it gives me a chance to try something else out. Here you see I'm using my Mahl Stick. That's that little homemade sort of support for my hand. I did it in another video, so I'll link down below to that video. It gives me a steady place to sit with my hand, and this time using a little liner brush, I've mixed up some really bright acid green colours. I'm adding just a few dots and dashes of detail here and there in my painting. It makes a change to have time to do this. I'm usually in a bit more of a hurry to finish my videos for you. But that's the whole reason behind painting slowly sometimes, is to take your time and to reflect on the painting and what you're doing, not to be in such a hurry. Now, to fix those reflections, I decided to use my liner brush just to pull out some detail, adding paint rather than just trying to blur it slightly. I'm using some horizontal strokes just to break the edges and create the reflections of the trees above. And on this right hand side I'm using some thinned dark green paint, again just to break up that hard edge. I want slightly bigger ripples in the foreground and smaller ones in the distance. Finally, a few little touches of highlight for a fir tree on the island. And I think we've almost got it cracked. There. A moment of reflection. Take time to enjoy your paintings. So there you have it. A moment of reflection inspired by a Bob Ross classic, Emerald Waters. Now, whilst you're taking a moment to reflect, watch another little video. It'll keep you reflecting a little bit longer. Happy painting, people.
Okay, so you've claimed all the canvases. These are all yours, are they? I see. Well, I don't think we can quite have all of these. I need some of them back. No. Oh, I see. Right, okay. Well, I'll have them back when you're finished with them then. Give us a smile. Yes, lovely baby. See what we have to put up with.